A few months back, a gentleman out in Oregon who had translated my book from English into Korean, he emailed me and he said, I need a list of the 16 meetings that you're going to be having while you're in Korea. And I said, okay. I said, give me a couple of days and let me think about it. So I went back and I got the 16 meetings, which ended up to be 18, but nevertheless, I wrote down the titles. And one of the last titles that I had, it was the Jesuit Order and Their Takeover of Korea. You know what? I had never studied the topic. Never studied it. But based on what Revelation chapter 17 says, I knew it was true. Well, I started preparing, up until the time I left, I was sending materials overseas and getting sermons ready and all kinds of things. And I didn't have any time to research the subject. And about 5 days before I was to leave, the gentleman in Oregon emailed me again and he said, the topic that the people in Korea most want to hear is the one about the Jesuit takeover of Korea, because they don't believe it's happened. And I said, oh no, I've got to research that out and I've got 5 days to do it? Well, about 3 days before I left, I went to the internet and I typed in the phrase, the Jesuits and Korea. And I started looking at website after website. And I began to gather information. And I had a packet when I got on the plane in Orlando of papers about that thick. It was about an inch thick of things that I had I need that article, print it. And out would come 5 or 6 pages. Go to another one, maybe 10 pages, maybe 15. I need that printed. And so I ended up with about an inch thick of materials. And on the flight from San Francisco to Seoul, I read through all that. And I came up with the Jesuit order in Korea. When I got there, I began to ask my interpreter a lot of questions about Korea. What was going on with the economy? What was it like since the Korean War? Have there ever been assassinations of leaders? How is Korea funded? Where do they get their money? Are they independent or are they connected to a World Bank somehow? I began peppering him with all these questions. And he was giving me answers, and I was able, with the materials I had studied and the information he gave me, to put together my talk on the Jesuits in Korea. And that's what I want to share with you today. Now, some of you have looked at pictures that I brought back that I had in the fellowship hall, and many of you commented on pictures that showed the modernized look of Seoul, Korea. And you said, well, that doesn't look like anything but an American city. You see, it looks just as modern as Chicago, New York, LA, San Francisco, any major U.S. city. And folks, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. One other note I want to mention, and then we'll get into the information. And that is, about 3 weeks before I left to go, a neighbor of mine who lives in New York State but winters here in Florida, I mentioned to him that I was going to Korea, and he said, oh, please take some pictures of the city of Seoul. And I said, well, are you sure? Why would you want that? And he said, I was in Seoul, Korea in the 1950s. because from 1950 to 1953, there was an awful war in Korea. And he said, when I was in Korea, Seoul was completely devastated. Completely devastated. And I remember last Sabbath, Graham, when we were talking about Korea, he said that the people in the central, which would be where Seoul is, and the people in the northern part of what is now South Korea, as the communist troops came down into what we know of today as South Korea, Seoul was almost like a ghost town, because people evacuated and went down to the very southern part of Korea. And they ended up in an area called Busan, which is right on the coast of southern Korea. So all of these things play a very, very major role in what the Jesuit order has done to take over South Korea today. Now, Korea, as we know it today, is divided into two parts, North and South Korea. Northern Korea is communist, basically controlled by the Chinese and the Russians. And at the 38th parallel, they have a demilitarized zone which is guarded by UN troops. And right there to the south of that 38th parallel, you have South Korea. And South Korea is as modern as any Western European nation. Now, how could I make such a outlandish statement as the Jesuit order had taken over Korea? Well, Revelation 17 and verse 2 says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now, the kings of the earth that are in unlawful wedlock with Rome and the Jesuit order, does that isolate and say, well, that doesn't include Korea? Does that only include European and South American and North American leaders? No, it doesn't say that. It says the kings of the earth have committed fornication with Babylon the Great, which would be Rome, i.e. the Jesuits, however you want to say it, means the same thing in essence. So the kings of the world, that means the leader of South Korea and the leader of North Korea, are all both under the control of Rome. You say, how can that be? One is communist, the other runs what he would call a democratic society, or a republic, as they call South Korea. Well, the terms Democrat, Republican, Republic, democracy, those are all simply terms, just like the words Nazi, Communist, Fascist. They're all terms that Rome has used to make it appear as though we have a lot of different factions across this earth. When in actuality, all of those terms go right up in smoke in the light of Revelation 17 and verse 2. So whether you have a communist term, capitalist, democracy, republic, doesn't matter what the term is, Revelation 17:2 says that Rome and the Jesuit order controls them. And it was based on that verse that I made the title for the talk that I had in Korea. One other thing that struck me as I began talking with this gentleman in Korea when I got there, my interpreter, John Lee, he said, Bill, you need to understand North Korea is bad because it's communist and it's controlled by China and Russia. I said, okay. I said, how about South Korea? He said, South Korea is good and America is good because America saved South Korea from the communists. Now, that's a very simplified statement as to what John was telling me. But folk, the concept that Koreans have in South Korea is that the Northern Koreans are bad because they're communist, but South Korea is good because they're Western. And America is good. And Harry Truman was a good guy because Harry Truman sent American troops into South Korea. Well, I mentioned to John, I said, John, it's clear from history that Joseph Stalin of Russia, was trained by the Jesuit order, and Joseph Stalin, his chief advisor, was a Jesuit priest. It's also clear that Mao Zedong in China was trained at a Yale Extension school that was a part of the Skull and Bones. And Mao Zedong was trained in one of those Yale Extension schools in China. So Russian leaders, Chinese leaders during the Korean War were both under the control of Rome and the Jesuit order. But Harry Truman was as well in America. And so was Dwight Eisenhower in America. Both of those men were allowed into their offices and into their positions because they were willing to follow what they were told to do. Now, this talk is not about Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower, but I'm sure, based on Revelation 17:2 and based on what I do know of what those men did, I am convinced that there is tons of evidence to back up what I've just said. But this talk is not about Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower. The fact is that God allowed the South Koreans a window of opportunity by bringing in a capitalist form of government with America coming in. However, South Korea is plagued today as bad, if not worse, than the North Koreans who are under communism. You say, how can that be? They have freedom. Well, they have freedom at the point of a sword. That's the kind of freedom the South Koreans have. And I'll show you what I mean momentarily. Now, one other statement from Great Controversy, page 234, that also helps me to understand how far Rome's drive is to take over the world, even South Korea. Great Controversy 234, it says, vowed to perpetual poverty and humility. It, the Jesuits, was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of the papal supremacy. So wherever Protestantism was taken, the Jesuit order was to go into that country, infiltrate it at the highest levels, take it over from the top, and then slowly dismantle it throughout. Now you say, but South Korea, the Korean people, they're not Protestants. They never have been Protestants. That's true. Throughout the history of Korea, what religion do you think has controlled predominantly throughout the last 2,000 years in Korea, more or less? What religion do you think? Buddhism. That's right, Buddhism. Now, is Buddhism Catholicism? No, it's not. Buddhism is the worship of Buddha with a whole set of beliefs in that vein. Buddhism is looked upon by Rome as an arch enemy. You look at the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, according to Avro Manhattan in his book Vietnam, Why Did We Go? It was fought because the Catholic Church wanted to create a superpower, a Catholic superpower in Southeast Asia. And they were going to use South Vietnam to do that. Vietnam was Buddhist, and the papacy wanted to destroy Buddhism. And so they went after it in Vietnam. So the Catholic Church does not like Buddhism. Well, let's look at what's happened in Korea. I want to read something to you. This was the first paper I read. This is taken from an internet site called www.sogang.ac.kr. And it simply says, the title is The Society of Jesus in Korea. Right there. Society of Jesus in Korea. And here is the Superior General, the Black Pope, Jean-Baptiste Janssens. He gave this statement in Rome on February 25th, 1955. Okay? Mark the date now, 1955. When did the Korean War end? 1953. 1953, the Korean War ended. 2 years later, in Rome, the Black Pope said this: in this marvelous evangelization of the noble Korean people, God wished that our least society have some part. Now, what did Jansen mean by that? When he, as the Black Pope, talks about evangelism of Korea, what does he mean? To make them Catholic. That's right. It doesn't mean he gave them the three angels' messages, does it? No. When Jansen talks about the evangelization of Korea, he is talking about the fact that Korea has now come under the control of Rome. Okay? That's what he means. Now, who did he say had a part in doing that? He said, God wished that our society, our least society, would have some part. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that the Jesuit order said, we are going to nail Korea. We are going to let it have it till it is forced to its knees to become Roman Catholic. Now, that's what he means. But he doesn't say it that way, does he? He makes it sound like they've reached out and given the gospel to win the people to Christ. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That was in 1955. Now, according to Janssens, by the middle of the 1950s, Rome and the Jesuit order controlled Korea, north and south. Now I want to go back and look at a little bit of history of Korea that I think, if you listen carefully, I think you'll be able to pick up the real reason why the Korean War was fought. Now keep in mind the Korean War and the statement in Revelation 18 verse 24. It says, in her, in Rome, was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. According to Revelation 18:24, Rome is responsible for the blood of prophets and saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. Now, people die in war, don't they? People die. Many, many millions died in Korea during that Korean War. According to Revelation 18:24, the papacy is responsible for the blood that's shed in our earth. According to Revelation 18:24, then, Rome and the Jesuit order was responsible for the Korean War. Now let's listen carefully to Korean history to try to figure out why the Korean War was fought. Okay? This statement I want to read to you, this is Korean history. This is taken from a website called asnic.utexas.edu. This was written by a professor of history at the University of Texas. And he said this: the surge of Christian mission activity. Now let's stop there for a moment. When this man writes the word, the surge of Christian mission activity, what's he talking about? He's talking about Catholicism. He's not talking about Protestantism or Seventh-day Adventism. He's talking about Catholicism. I'll read on a little bit further. The way this is what he says. The surge of Christian mission activity began to reach Korea as early as the 17th century, when copies of Catholic missionary Matteo Ricci's works in Chinese were brought back from Peking by the annual tributary mission sent there to exchange gifts with the Chinese emperor. Okay? So Catholic tracts, papers were brought into Korea as early as the 17th century. That'd be the 1600s. It says, along with religion doctrine, the material included aspects of Western learning, such as a more accurate calendar system and other matters that attracted the attention of the learning school in Korea. By the 18th century, the 1700s, there were several converts to the Western doctrine. No priests entered Korea until 1785, when a Jesuit, Father Peter Gremont, crossed the border secretly and began baptizing believers and ordaining clergy. Now, there was a reason why the Catholic Church did not enter into Korea. The Koreans had a law that foreign religion could not be taught on Korean soil. I'll read it to you. Here it is. It says, another foreign priest, a Chinese Catholic called Father Chu Mun Mu in Korean, followed 10 years later. Though the propagation of foreign religion on Korean soil was technically against the law, a tolerant or lackadaisical administration resulted in a rather liberal view of the Catholic movement, though there were sporadic persecutions. So the Catholic Church and the Jesuits came into Korea in the 17th century, the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s. But it says that that was against the law, and from time to time there were persecutions. Now, let me ask you something. When a Catholic priest or a Jesuit is killed in some country, how does Rome and the Jesuit order feel about that? That's it, David. It's called payback. They will bide their time until they have a sufficient capability to go in and demolish that country. And it's called payback. That's what Hiroshima and Nagasaki were. They were payback. Why? Because in 1639, the Japanese shogun abolished and drove the Jesuit order and the Catholics out of Japan. And he said, as long as the sun sets, no foreign Catholic missionary will ever be allowed on Japanese soil. That was in 1639. For at least 200 plus years, no missionary, no Catholic entered Japan to do missionary work. Finally, in the early 1850s, American gunboats headed up by Commodore Perry went around to Japan and started bombing the mainland of Japan, and the Japanese said, you can come right on in. And who do you think came in right after Admiral Perry's bombs started landing on mainland Japan? The Catholic and Jesuit missionaries. And over the next century, the Jesuits and the Catholics worked their way into high offices, controlled the powers of Japan, till finally they were at the point of destruction. And that's why you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Payback. That's what it is. You go to Europe and all the wars that have been fought in Europe since the 16th century, the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Why all those wars that have made Germany and other parts of Europe red with the blood of Europeans? Why? It's called payback. Because that's where the Protestant Reformation began, was in Germany. And so we have payback again and again and again to annihilate the voice of Protestantism in Germany and throughout Europe. So, persecution in Korea of Catholic and Jesuit missionaries and priests. Listen to this. We go on with the article. By the year 1863, Civil War in America, Civil War in Mexico, 12 Korean priests presided over a community of about 23,000 Catholic believers. At that point, there came to power a prince called Tawangun, who blamed all of Koreans' problems on outside encroachments. What does that mean? The new leader of Korea, his name was Tawangun, he said all the problems we have here in Korea are the result of foreign missionaries. The Catholic missionaries have come in here and now we have problems. So what did they do? What did Tawangun do? Persecution began in earnest in Korea. It continued for 13 years till 1876. In 1876, Tawangun lost his power. Korea was forced to sign treaties with Western powers, guaranteeing the safety of foreign missionaries and their freedom to engage in proselytizing. So for 13 years there was persecutions of Roman Catholics and Jesuits in Korea, till finally in 1876 the Catholic Church was able, through the aid of the French, to force the Koreans to sign treaties so that foreign missionaries could come in. Going on, same article, in 1925, a total of 79 Koreans who had been martyred were beatified at St. Peter's Basilica, and in 1968 an additional 24 were beatified. So many people, many Catholic and Jesuit missionaries were persecuted and slain in Korea in the 1800s. And what do we learn from history? And I say it again. When that happens, the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order, they bide their time. They wait for the golden opportunity when they have sufficient military power and sufficient political control and funds available. And they say, now it's time to pay that back. And so, folk, I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, the reason why the Korean War was fought between 1950 and 1953 was to pay back the people of Korea for the persecutions and the killings of Catholic and Jesuit missionaries in Korea. It's very interesting. Another fascinating aspect of the Korean War. After the Korean War ended, the number of Catholic relief organizations and missionaries increased, and the Korean Catholic Church grew very quickly. 1962, a Korean church hierarchy was established. By 1986, there were 3 archdioceses and 14 dioceses in Korea. John Paul visited Korea in 1984, and 93 Korean martyrs were canonized by the church. This was the first time that a canonization ceremony had been held outside the Vatican. It gave Korea the 4th largest number of Catholic martyrs in the world. Did you notice what happened, folk, after the Korean War? What happened? Did you notice that? Korean churches, Catholic churches, spread all over Korea. Why? How could they do that now? What happens during a time of war? Seoul was demolished. Korea looked completely devastated. And so when a country is devastated by war, how do they do this? How do they rebuild the country? Outside money. Did the Korean people have money? They had nothing. Their land was devastated. It was smashed like a pancake. They had nothing, folks. So where did the money come from to rebuild their country? It came from American, European bankers. It came from the wealthy people of the world. And who controls the wealthy people of our world? Revelation 18 and verse 15. What does the Bible say? Revelation 18 and verse 15. Revelation 18:15 says, the merchants of these things which were made rich. How were they made rich? How do the international bankers have wealth and power? By her. And who's her? It's Rome. It's Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And so by 1953, the Korean people were completely devastated and in desperation for outside financing, for outside merchants to come in and rebuild their country. Now, when you come in with all that wealth to rebuild a country, who now has power? Who controls the country? Do the Korean people? It's not the people that are planting rice and growing tea and growing corn. They're not the ones that are going to control and build the sky-rise apartment buildings to house the people that don't have homes. Who's running Korea after the Korean War? It's the international bankers. And the international bankers, according to Revelation 18 and verse 15, are controlled by Rome and the Jesuit order. I asked my interpreter, John, I said, John, tell me something. After the Korean War, when all this foreign money started pouring into Korea, I said, were there certain businesses that started to develop in Korea that were giants in the business industry? He said, yeah. How did you know? I said, because, John, it's a pattern. I said it happened in America after the Civil War. America was devastated. So who came to America? Foreign money in a man by the name of Jacob Schiff. And Jacob Schiff worked for the Rothschilds, and the Rothschilds worked for the Jesuits. And so through all this Catholic money, through Jacob Schiff, we have the building of the railroads of Leland Stanford and Averell Harriman. We have the steel giant Andrew Carnegie. We have J.P. Morgan and shipping. All of that comes to America. Huge, gigantic corporations. You have the Rockefellers, controlled and financed by the Jesuit order and Rothschild family. So exactly what happened in America after the Civil War, it happened in Korea after the Korean War. And it happened in Europe after World War I and after World War II. Today, Korea, the folk over in Korea told me, they said they are utterly and completely dependent upon the International Monetary Fund. And what is the International Monetary Fund? It is the world's Federal Reserve. That's what it is. It's a world bank. And through a world bank, you control nations at the point of a sword. I want to read a couple of statements to you about foreign banks, having a foreign bank or a central bank. Thomas Jefferson. This is from the book The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. It's on page 329. Jefferson said this, a private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. So it would be better for every nation in this world, or even just the Chinese army, to come up and to take living quarters across this nation. It would be better for that to happen than for us to have a central bank. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. Louis McFadden. a famous congressman that probably none of us have ever heard of. That's how famous he is. There's a reason why none of us have heard of him. Louis T. McFadden was the chairman of the Committee on Banking and Currency. He was a congressman back in the 1920s and 30s. June 10th, 1932, he made these comments. Now, Louis McFadden was not some fly-by-night. He was the chairman in the House of the Committee on Banking and Currency. He said this: Mr. Chairman, we have been dealing with the effect of things rather than with the cause of things. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The iniquities of the Federal Reserve Board and banks acting together have cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it. Now, who are the money vultures that control the Federal Reserve? Revelation 18:15 tells us who the money vultures are who control the central banks of America and of the world. Babylon the Great. McFadden, I don't believe, understood how far it went back and it ends up in Rome. I don't think he understood that. But he did understand the horrors of a central bank. He said the Federal Reserve Bank is a private credit monopoly which preys upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves. The Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind Colonel House, Edward Mandell House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten monarchical institution of the King's Bank to control us from the cradle to the grave. In other words, the imperial power of elasticity of the public currency is wielded exclusively by these central corporations owned by the banks. Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its power, but the truth is, the Federal Reserve Board has usurped the government of the United States. Louis McFadden made it very, very clear that there was a hidden conspiracy by the Federal Reserve of the international bankers and the Jesuit order to destroy the freedoms and the liberties of this great nation. It's quite interesting. Shortly after his talk, Louis McFadden, congressman, suffered several attacks. First, someone tried to assassinate him with 2 revolver shots fired from an ambush. He was getting out of a cab in front of a District of Columbia hotel. Both shots missed him and were buried in the structure of the cab. Then, after eating a meal at a political banquet in the nation's capital, he became violently ill. His life was saved from what was subsequently announced as a poisoning by the presence of a friend in attendance at the banquet, a physician. The doctor procured a stomach pump and subjected the congressman to emergency treatment. However, 4 short years after he made that speech in Congress, and after 2 assassination attempts, one by shooting, the other by poisoning, in 1936, October 3, Louis McFadden died of sudden heart failure. It happened after a dose of intestinal flu. Quite honestly, I would have to question and wonder about his sudden heart failure. Folk, anytime somebody goes after the Federal Reserve, they get it. Because the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church understand, as long as they control a nation's money flow, they've got it by the throat. And because they have it by the throat, after the Korean War, the Jesuits and the Catholics came in with all this wealth to build Korea through American and European investors, and the Korean people looked upon those men as their saviors. And they would do whatever they told them to do. And as a result, the money came in. And what came in right along the tail of the money? All the missionaries, all the priests, the Jesuit priests and Jesuit missionaries came in right after the money. You know what, folks? When you go back and you look in history, that is exactly what the Catholic Church has been doing for the last 600 years. Because whenever the Portuguese and the French and the Spanish would go out and look for new places to buy and sell goods with their traders and their merchants on those ships, who always was on those merchant ships? The Catholic and Jesuit missionaries. And so they'd bring in their money and their wealth and their goods, and they always brought in their religion right along with them. They did it 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, all through those centuries, all through those years. And now they use war. Demolish a country, bring in all that foreign capital, and then they bring in their doctrines right behind it. Little wonder that a Catholic priest, right around 1850, I could get you the exact date, but he made a statement. He said, by the year 1900, Rome will have America, and Rome will keep her. They knew, folk, because they'd been so successful down through the ages, that once you demolish a country by war, then you bring on all that money. People have no more voice. They do exactly what they're told. As a result, Catholic missionaries, as the historian from the University of Texas said, they've started coming in by the droves. The archdiocese, 3 of them have been established in Korea. Schools have been established, a Jesuit college. The people were telling me in Korea, they said, we'd never heard of a Jesuit college until after the Korean War. And then all of a sudden we have a Jesuit university on our soil. And I said, and what do you think they're doing in that Jesuit school? They said, well, they're probably training young Koreans, once they graduate, to then go into high offices in the government of Korea. And the people of Korea will look at them and say, oh, they're Koreans. They're looking out for the betterment of our country. When in actuality, those men have been trained by the Jesuits to do exactly what they're told, so that Rome can take and hold that country in their hands. So that's why they've established a Jesuit university in South Korea. Schools have been there. So they have the government in their hands, and they have the religions in their hand, and they have the money in their hands. One other point I found very, very interesting. Whenever Rome goes in and takes over a country, God will always have, at some point, for whatever reason, some leader will buck the system. Some leader or leaders will say, no, this is wrong for my people. And they will have enough loyalty to the people of their country that they will oppose the money people. And I asked the man in Korea, I said, tell me, since the Korean War, have any leaders ever been killed? And he said, yeah, there has been. I said, well, who did it? And he said, well, it was done by a gentleman from, he said it was a communist, had assassinated first the leader's wife, and then eventually got him too. And I said, and you were told it was done by a communist? He said, yeah, it was a communist. I said, no, it wasn't a communist. And I said, what was this man doing? His name was Bak Chun-yi, I believe that's what they said. Bak Chun-yi. He was killed, I think they said, in 1978. But Bak Chun-yi was building up South Korea, helping the people of South Korea, giving them a lot of things to make life a whole lot better for them, was granting them freedoms. And then all of a sudden, Bak Chun-yi was eliminated. I only know of one power in this world that uses poisoning, assassination, strangling cord to get rid of unfaithful leaders. And that is the Jesuit order in the Catholic Church. So much of what we find having happened in Korea has already happened in the United States. There's a reason why the pictures give us the distinct impression that Seoul, Korea looks like a modern 20th century American city, or for that matter, a European city. It's because it was built by American and European capital. And all for the same reason, and done by the same people, the Jesuits of Rome. Let us pray. Dear Father in heaven, in the midst of all that we've studied today, thank you that you have a people in South Korea that are preparing to meet you in the clouds of heaven. Thank you that they're preparing their lives and sharing your messages with other people. Thank you so much that in the midst of their prosperity, that people are taking advantage of it and getting your messages out as quickly as possible. Father in heaven, thank you that in the midst of the apparent prosperity in America that we know is going to come crashing down, thank you that in the midst of this few moments left, thank you that we still have opportunities to share your messages all over the world. Help us to take advantage of the opportunities, the windows that are still creaking open. Help us to use it for your name's honor and glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Charlotte, please. Let's get a mic. Can we get the mic to her? Sir.
About Iraq. There was a Catholic one over there. That was a missionary. Christianity into modern world?
Jim, I believe there have been a lot of Islamic peoples that have been very much opposed to the Pope and what he's trying to do. And I think, Jim, that Iraq is a warning to what will happen to any group of Islamic people that dare resist the authority of Rome. And they're seeing that right now. The country's being devastated. I don't know, Jim, of any reason why there would be payback unless it is that Iraq, being a predominantly Islamic country, has been very opposed to Rome's involvement in that nation. And that could be why there's having war there now, and this could be payback on them. Charlotte.
Where do the Jesuits get all their money?
Well, Charlotte, I guess the best example I can give you is the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Follow me carefully. The Battle of Waterloo, it was between Napoleon and the British general, I forgot his name. Wellington. Whoever was going to win that war, Charlotte, would rule Europe. If Napoleon won, the French would rule Europe. If Wellington won, the British would rule Europe. Rothschilds, Nathan Rothschild, who was a very, very wealthy man in England, who was controlled by the Jesuits, controlled by the Jesuit order. Nathan Rothschild had agents at the battlefield. And as the battle was progressing, and it was obvious Wellington was going to win, the Rothschild agents went over to the British Channel there, took a boat from France over to England, and Rothschild was waiting right there at the coast. The Rothschild agent told him, England's going to win that battle. Nathan Rothschild knew, before anybody else in the British Stock Exchange knew it. Went into the London Stock Exchange that morning, and he had agents all over the floor. And he said, sell our stock. Sell it. See? And what happened, Charlotte, is he was selling it because at that point it was still worth something. But if news came back to England that France had won, the stock wouldn't be worth a nickel. Okay? Well, see...